Out of all the video game franchises that I grew up with back in the old days, Crash Bandicoot was my first trip into the magical realm of console gaming. Since the Bandicoot already celebrated his 20th anniversary, and he's finally coming back after years of absence, it's the perfect time to look back and express my personal thoughts on the series, since these games were a huge part of my childhood in gaming. So for the classic series, I started off with the third game, then worked backwards. The original PlayStation was my very first video game console, and Crash 3 was the very first video game I ever played. So yeah, I have a lot of nostalgia and memories of that loony Bandicoot. So now it's time to look at almost all of the Crash games that I played in chronological order. The first Crash game that introduced the series was... okay. The game was fun and all, but the controls were stiff since this was before the analog sticks were a thing, and it's very difficult when it comes to collecting the gems and saving your progress. To get a gem in this game, you had to break every box in a level in one go without dying. Checkpoints don't count. And in order to save your game, you have to either collect a gem or beat one of those ton of bonus stages. Or maybe use a password or something, but I never used the whole password system back then. So yeah, the first game was okay, but it hasn't really aged well over the years. And then came Crash Bandicoot 2, introducing us to the classic Crystals MacGuffins, a slide and the body slam abilities, and a new way to save your game that is more simple and easy. This was a lot of fun to play, and it still is. Some would even go as far as say that this is the definitive Crash game out of the classic trilogy. But even with that, it still has a good amount of challenge, like collecting the colored gems, going through death routes, or playing those jetpack levels with some epic music playing in the background. And then we had Crash 3, which was my personal favorite for nostalgia reasons. And it had a lot of vehicle segments, like riding on Pura on the Great Wall of China, or driving a motorcycle against a bunch of lab assistants. We also had a lot more of a full-fledged voice cast this time, since the first one barely had anything, since they were all done by one guy. The second one we had a little more voice acting, but here almost everybody talks. So yeah, we get to hear Clemsy Brown and his gravelly voice filter for Uka Uka, the intelligence of Dr. Entropy, and Mel Winkler with his role of the wise Aku Aku. Music is really great, and I still love playing this day. It was one of the first video games that I ever played, and it still continues to be one of my all-time favorite video games. Team Racing, the first spin-off game to the Bandicoot, and one of the first kart racing games that I played. There was also an adventure mode to play with, since I think that was kind of new for its time with kart racing games. But other than that, all of the different playable characters were a lot of fun to play. Ripperoo, Crash, Cortex, Pinstripe, and others. As well as Penta Penguin, the unfinished character that can only be playable by typing in a cheat code. But yeah, it's a great kart racing game. Crash Bash, the first party game featuring the Crash Bandicoot characters, and it was okay. Some of the minigames are alright, and some of them were just annoying. Ones I didn't like the most were the pogo stick levels and the tank levels. Ones I did enjoy were the polar bear levels and the box throwing levels. Besides, it's the only Crash game where you can pick up a TNT crate and throw it at someone. That was always fun. It took me a while to beat the game's story, with both good and evil, and it took me even longer to unlock all of the minigames. But in the end, Bash was a very meh game. The Wrath of Cortex, the game that was supposed to be something new, but decided to play safe and just recycle elements from Crash 3. It feels like this game is heavily mixed with opinions. Sure, it looks and plays like a Crash game, but it still needs improvements like, obviously, the loading screens. Well, at least they weren't as aggravating as the ones in Spyro Enter the Dragonfly. Oi. For me, I thought this game was alright. The Atmosphere levels were fun, but I do feel like they went a bit overboard with the vehicle levels. And for once, we actually get to play Coco in a platform level, rather than having her be stuck in vehicles like in Crash 3. So yeah, Wrath of Cortex was okay. Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure. When I first looked at the box art, I actually thought it was a Game Boy Advance port of the first game. But it wasn't. But they recycled models, levels, and music from the old Crash games. I didn't play this until much later, and it was okay. Didn't really have anything new or anything. Crash Bandicoot 2 Entrance, the second GBA Crash game, which is much better than the previous one. We get some more challenging levels and the option to collect time relics, since they were usually mandatory to get the real ending of the game. And the levels themselves were much better structured than the previous GBA title. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. One of my favorite GBA games. Crash Nitro Kart, the second racing game. Well, it plays out like CTR, but a bit differently, like the whole anti-gravity sections in the game, which, now that I think about it, it kind of makes me think that this was an inspiration for Nintendo to make Mario Kart 8. Anyway, there aren't that many playable characters like before, and the music is very forgettable. All I can remember was the main menu theme. But it plays alright, nothing game-breaking or anything, it just doesn't live up to the CTR standards. Crash Purple, Ripto's Rampage. Ah yes, the time when Crash Bandicoot and Spyro crossed over. I was hyped for it back then, seeing two of my childhood gaming icons finally crossing over, and nowadays, they're very meh. Instead of action-packed platformer, it's just a bunch of minigames. At least Crash Purple is a hell of a lot better than Spyro Orange. Crash to Insanity. Oh boy, I had a lot of fun playing this game. It was also the first time they tried to do a bit of a free roaming, which I'd be all up for it if they decided to do that again in a new Crash game. The story was interesting, and Lex Lang was a great playing Cortex, being both maniacal and comical at the same time. Although it has a lot of new things going for it, it does feel a bit rushed once you find out about all of the scrap content for this game. Seriously, there could be a whole documentary dedicated to this, just like how there's a documentary dedicated to Superman Lives. But in the end, Twinsanity was a great game, but there could have been more of it. Crash Tag Team Racing. This was when the characters' personalities started to change drastically. You know, Crunch acting like Crash's mother while sounding like Mr. T, and Crash's random babbling and so on. It's supposed to be a new racing game, but it's heavily focuses on the platforming segments in the hub worlds rather than have it be something like CTR. The humor feels a bit mixed to me. Sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's not. I don't know about this game. It's kind of like Shadow the Hedgehog, a game that I just can't make up my mind whether it's good or bad. Crash Boom Bang. Not really gonna talk about this game on the list, simply because I'm saving that for a Forgotten Media episode. All I can say about this game is that it's another party game, and Crash Bash was much better. Crash of the Titans, oh boy. The game that introduced us to new character designs, and all hell broke loose in the fanbase. And yes, I was one of them, as evident in that piss-poor rant that I made years ago, which still haunts me to this day. Well, at least that video actually taught me something to actually script my videos first, rather than pulling out random guff out of my ass. But looking back at it now, the whole deal of gameplay about riding monsters and whatnot, it wasn't that bad. Sure, the fighting mechanics can get a bit redundant sometimes, but at least they were trying to do something new, rather than doing another Wrath of Cortex or Nitro Kart again. The character designs don't bother me that much as they used to. I can still recognize most of the characters, except for Uka Uka and Tiny. Their designs were so drastic that I don't know who they were at first. But yeah, designs don't bother me. New personalities, on the other hand, really got on my nerves. Crunch again being the motherly Mr. T, Engine started to get more annoying, Cortex feels less maniacal and more comical, and do I really need to say anything about Tiny's personality? Back then, I thought it was the worst Crash game ever. But looking back at it now, it doesn't feel as bad as I thought it was. One of these days, I'll give that game a second chance. Mind Over Mutants. I never played this game since I rage quitted after Titans, but from what I've heard, it plays exactly like Titans, except you have the option to store Monster while riding another one, and backtracking. Lots and lots of backtracking. So it sounds like I wasn't really missing much. The only thing I can criticize about this game is Embryo. It's nice to see him return, and his new voice sounds great, but just like with the other characters, the personality is all wrong. He's so annoying, constantly going on about how he invented everything, like, oh, I invented sneakies, I invented coolers, and I'm like, he doesn't act like Brio, he acts more like Ken Penders. But other than that, never really played Mind Over Mutants. And that's all the Crash Bandicoot games that I've played, minus the last one. I never got a chance to play any of the mobile phone games that came out after that, and for a while I felt like Crash was dead and that Activision put a curse on the franchise. And then they proved me wrong when they announced the upcoming Insane Trilogy. I've already talked about it and I'm super hyped for it, but one interesting thing about this game is that I lost a bet with a friend of mine over it. But that's another story, I'll probably explain about that in a different video. But anyway, that wraps up this retrospective, so yeah, bye!